Migrate back to your seats.
49%.
Okay. Well, thanks. And again, I think much appreciation to our panelists or to our presenters in the first half to just lay kind of a foundation of understanding of how the current system works, the current dollars in that system, the funding gaps, and the kind of various mechanisms that affect that. What we want to do in this second part is to kind of apply the background knowledge to real contexts and let some practitioners who are in various relationships with the application of this in different districts, in different regions in the state, kind of muse with us to start the conversation about some of the implications, some of the opportunities for change, how we might think about designing an even better system going forward for the state of Colorado. Moving across, many of them I'm sure need no introduction, but I will anyway. We have Scott Murphy, who's the superintendent of Littleton Public Schools. We have Lucinda Hundley, representative from the Consortium of Special Education Directors. We have Glenn Gustafson, CFO of Colorado Springs School District 11, and Dale McCall, the Executive Director of Colorado BOCES Association. And so, Scott, I'm going to throw the first question out to you, and hopefully all the panelists can weigh in on this. We've heard about how the dollars get allocated, and it's clear that there's a gap, and that the state is not able to kind of fully fund that portion that should be allocated towards the education of special education students. Is it as simple as figuring out ways for the state to fulfill that share that it is not currently fulfilling, to bring up to the maximum funding? Or what are the other possible alternatives for rethinking the design of special education allocation? If you could just kind of start the conversation off, is it just a matter of filling the gap that is not there, or where else do we take the conversation?
And Lucinda would like to speak right now. I'm not sure I know. I looked at that question and I said, you know, we've got different alternatives for funding, but they have to go before the voters. We've talked for years about a statewide property tax. I don't know if that's possible. But I guess some people have said this already in one way or another, and I heard Carol ask a question that led into it. I just want to give a short flyover. School finance, I want to put it in this context. We have an engine on a train, and that engine is our base funding. We've got to affect this in some way. That engine has cars attached to it. It has at-risk car. It has cost of living car. It has size. It has a number of cars, but there's a car that's missing on that, and it's special education. And so if we're trying to get over the mountain to serve children, to fund them, we don't even know if that base is sufficient enough. We don't know if it can even get over the mountain to begin with. And then we look at the other car sitting on another track and say, well, we got to have a car to pull that one off the mountain. So we sell the first engine, get a smaller engine for that, take a small engine to pull the other one over, and we still don't know with special education where we can fund it, because what we're talking about is costs. We don't know what the costs totally are in special ed. We know what the expenditures are. And if you look at expenditures, you're really looking at a figure of 80% that was told to us would be funded of our expenditures, still not knowing the cost. And that statute was repealed. My concern that I would at least express with this when we think about funding is we have to begin with a true examination of the costs. We have to attach it to the formula, because one of the things, I was a CFO, and one of the things we did is we'd look at, well, how much money are we getting? We didn't look at the subcomponents. We just needed to know what are the costs, how much money we're getting. And we have this system, and I know it's a little tongue-in-cheek, but we believe in free and appropriate public education. FAPE, 1975. We've never dealt with free and appropriate payment for education. And when we do that, we're going to get a little further in terms of what we can fund or what the system ought to be. We have a segregated system. We put special ed aside. There is an inclusion into the formula, what it takes to educate the whole child. We have children that have multiple services. We have children that are in the classroom, children that are not in the classroom. So I'm backing up and not giving a direct answer. But I think we need to put it in context, because the implications when we put it aside and do something else and fund it over here, we don't have everyone at the table. And I think that's a mistake. So.
One takeaway clearly is that we should begin with, or we should at least ask the question of what does it really cost to educate these children, and work backwards from there.
Yes.
And that's the conversation we haven't had. Lucinda, anything you'd add in?
I'd like to tag on to what Scott said, and I need to tell you, he was my former superintendent before I retired from Littleton, so if we misbehave, it's because we've done it for a lot of years. The consortium of special ed directors, and our membership is every special ed director in the state. We've talked about this, and I guess I want to say to you, we believe strongly there's a difference between expenditures and costs. And I don't think we know what the true costs are, as Scott said, and I want to give you a couple of examples of why we might not know that. Let's talk about geographic proximity of small districts out on the plains who haven't had a full-time speech pathologist forever and have to hire speech language assistants and have remote access to a speech language pathologist to supervise them. I'd question if kids are really getting the speech language services they need. Or the fact that through the BOCES they share services, and those folks put in as much windshield time driving from one geographic location to another. What are the true costs if they actually had the resources available to them to hire? Does that make sense? Just as a tiny little example. But I would echo, the consortium would echo, we absolutely need to know what the true costs are. I want to jump in here and add a clarification to Peg and Leanne's presentation. I was part of that 2006 conversation around the special education funding model. And I want to tell you just a couple of things, lest you think we were absolutely nuts at the time. The consortium was very involved. We were approached by Representative Jack Palmer, who had, he thought, $48 million that could come to special education. I think it was Ref C money. And we had an opportunity in about that much time to develop a funding model. We had no time. Another one of our recommendations is going to be what I'm about to say. We had no time to analyze effective funding models in other states. We had what I referred to as 5 minutes to develop a funding model. So we did some quick simulations. We looked at average costs. It was not scientific. We came up with that basic $1,250 for every kid. We identified the Tier B kids because we knew they cost more money, but we backed into the $6,000 because it was what was available. It was not based on cost. It was not based on need, but it was at least a start to improve special education funding by $48 million. So to not answer your question also, I would echo what Scott said, that we absolutely have to determine what the actual costs are, and I would add a little bit more detail. I would determine what those costs are by district, and I would divide it out by Tier A, Tier B, actual high cost. And Senator Johnston, that's one last thing about high cost I want to tell you. We know what the high costs are, at least what they are, based on applications. Not every district applies because they know based on the formula they won't get high cost kids funded, so they don't apply. So when you look at the slide Leanne put up about the requests for funding for high cost, put the words "at least" by those words, because we don't know the true costs of high cost kids.
Glenn, I'm not even going to put a question, lest you feel like you have to answer a question, but I'm going to let you respond to what you've heard so far. What's the heart of the matter as you listen to this discussion?
Well, it's such a complicated matter, and I guess this might sound odd from the bean counter of the table, but although Scott's really a bean counter at heart, that one of the things I worry about is all the different variables in this equation, including maintenance of effort, least restrictive environment, litigious parents, high severe needs, challenging academic growth, all those things that work in conjunction with each other. It's important for us to remember, and I think Senator Johnston said this early, that we're trying to build a 21st century school funding model to match our 21st century instructional model. And in my opinion, the system as it is now does not promote academic growth for special needs students. It fails miserably in that attempt. And it's almost like we're handcuffed with so many variables, one of which is funding, but there's a whole lot of others that make it so challenging, if not impossible, to get academic growth from these children. And so I would just say with all that, it's such a complicated answer. Sometimes my father always told me, if you overcomplicate it, you're making it too difficult. Try oversimplifying it. And that's where I think in this case, if you put it in the base, I mean, we already know we're only getting 30, 35% on the dollar for reimbursement, then it makes sense to put it in the base so that we quit identifying kids and putting labels on them and restricting their academic growth and start really developing a model that would promote student achievement for special needs kids.
Get some responses to that view. Dale, how about from your vantage point?
Yeah.
The BOCES provides a different structure where this might get addressed. What's your...
Yeah, you know, I'm with the BOCES Association, and we deal a lot with rural school districts, and I agree that we've got to examine the costs, and we've got to include in all those variables that are different in many areas of the state. The cost variables for East Central BOCES that you saw on the screen with the travel time and the lack of ability to hire qualified special ed providers, those all play into that. On the shortage thing, I think this is, you know, may not be a school finance issue, but if we don't solve the shortage problem for special ed personnel, we're not going to be able to get those growth in achievement that we want. We did a study, Colorado BOCES Association, with the Colorado Department of Education a few years ago, and found out that we were 75 qualified speech language pathologists short, and that was only 2/3 of the special ed administrative units that responded. And so we got together with higher ed and said, what's happened? They said, well, we've been cut, so we've reduced programs. Used to be 5 or 6 in the Cindy, I don't know. 7 programs to train speech language pathologists. Now there are 3. And it was in a room that we said, okay, we went around the table with the folks preparing speech language pathologists in the state and said, how many are you preparing? They went around the room and indicated how many graduates they'd have. And the DPS representative said, we need all of those. And DPS would need all of those to meet their needs. So somehow we've got to incentivize the training of more people that would then help us get the qualified people out there working with those students to meet that achievement gap. And until we do that, you know, it's just, the achievement's just not going to happen. And I do think that, you know, we can't just take these simple questions about what's the state role in special education, because, you know, special education is a federal program. I'm going to use Ken DeLay's comments. Special education is a federal program administered at the state level, and of course we also have some state laws to follow. But when we talk about, you know, what's the cost and what's the relationship between the state and the federal, we got to talk about that as a whole. And then we got to try to figure that out as how together we get enough funds to provide quality services to all these kids. You know, I've been in the business for 40 years, and I don't know an educator out there that doesn't want to provide quality services to special ed students if we can get past some of these barriers, and we want all those kids to achieve at the appropriate level. We just need some support to do that. And I can't tell you what the percentage should be that the state pays. I just know that the state of Colorado doesn't pay enough. And all you have to do is look at Wyoming, just talking to Peg. And I experienced this firsthand. We had a superintendent move into northern Colorado when I was at Centennial BOCES, and He just came unglued the second day he was on the job when he looked at the special ed budget. And he came to me and he says, "You got to be kidding. This cost me this much for special education." He was used to the state paying 100% in Wyoming. And so we've got to take a look at that. We need more revenue in the system some way to meet all these expectations, not only for special ed, but for all students.
Okay. Well, let me just kind of see if I can restate some of the parameters. I mean, we're working within a fairly tight box right now because we've heard that we don't really know what the true costs are. We can identify what the expenses are, but that is not necessarily an accurate proxy for what the real costs are. There's a general agreement that however the funding arrives to serve students, it's not adequate. And so we can kind of stipulate that for this conversation. I'm wondering, within the limited parameters of what could be changed, whether it's the tiered structure, the base versus the categoricals, just to maybe get a couple of ideas from the panel to start the conversation, and then we'll welcome the rest of the participants in. Maybe any specific ideas to start the solution process. What would you change that you think, it may not change everything. Again, we'll leave aside a conversation about overall adequacy of funding and this question of needing to determine the real cost. But aside from those, what is one thing that you think should be a part of the 21st century school finance system that would improve our chances of educating all students with special education needs? Just even one thing that you think should be a part of that solution. We'll take a couple ideas from the panel and then we'll open it to the audience.
What I'm going to suggest has nothing to do with money. There is a task force that PEG is chairing called Reinventing Special Education, and she and I've talked previously about how much time would they need. The idea behind it is to look at what are existing barriers in state policy, state rules that could be eliminated, that could increase effectiveness in how we serve kids with disabilities. Let me give you an example. It speaks to Dale's point about shortage. We have a really lousy relationship around reciprocity. For folks coming from other states where we don't accept their licensure, that by itself, Colorado has great attractiveness, I think, to folks from other states. That alone could be one example. There is such a focus, I'm going to give you another one. There's such a focus on compliance, filling in the right form, the right line, the right people, the right words, that this issue around student achievement, so much of time of our special educators and administrators goes towards a compliance mindset. In fact, CDE, up until just recently, said it's of itself that it was a compliance agency. Those would be two recommendations the consortium would make. Actually, it's about letting the Reinventing Special Ed Task Force do its work. I understand from PEG they might be able to come back with some recommendations within 4 months.
Scott? All right, so let me just restate that there might be efficiencies and improvements to be made even apart from funding that might actually free up some dollars is one.
This isn't a genie in a bottle, but it's a small step that could in fact positively impact the shortages question.
And we certainly don't want to discount ideas that would improve special education in general, with particular eye on the school finance aspect of it, but we appreciate you noting those as well. Scott, sounds like you were going to offer a...
Well, I may be doing what you don't want to do then. I'm thinking of an issue we dealt with, and it was around a compliance issue. Our objective is to help all students' achievement go up. And if you think about it, today, every teacher in our school system should be considered a special ed teacher. We're asking children to be mainstreamed, but yet, are we training our teachers in that way? And now, you have to ask, are we training our special ed teachers to be literacy specialists? And what happens is we keep our funding separate, and we don't put it together in such a way that we save money, because we're going to be utilizing dollars in a much better way. It may be a savings on the general fund, could be a savings in special ed, but literacy training is absolutely essential. If we're going to lower the gap in achievement with our special education kids, and we have grants or special ed funding that says, no, you can't do that. You can have the same training, but you're going to have to train the special ed teachers over here, and you're going to have to train the non-special ed teachers over there. That's foolish. That's not where we're going.
Let's turn to the audience. So I think that's a good one to spark. So one might make the case from that of putting it more into the base operations, that increasing the capacity of all teachers to meet the needs of students, special ed or otherwise. might be an implication. Other thoughts that you might have of what you've heard so far that could potentially be a part of the solutions of creating a 21st century system. And we'll let you begin with at least identifying what some of the challenges that you see in the current system that you want to run by the panel. And we've got microphones in the back as well.
I just have a quick question. I'm not expert in any way in this particular area, but I have heard how other states use a census-based identification model where instead of actually counting the kids in the district, they use a census average over all of the districts in the state. And it seems to me, I know there are some advantages and some disadvantages. I've heard that states that use it are very happy with it. I know last time we looked at this issue, there was not a lot of support for that, but I just thought you could maybe say a couple words about it.
Mm-hmm. How you might imagine that affecting districts. Would that be a net gain, net drawback?
I've always been really interested in that model. I think Mary Rubidoux, who was superintendent in Telluride for a number of years, did something similar to that just in her small district that I think that makes sense to me in terms of getting away from the specific identification. And I know we have a lot of limitations on that. There's some things we can't do, but and obviously there would be a few challenges, but if you had a high risk pool to offset the risk of that, I think that makes sense to me in terms of getting away from the bureaucracy and processing of special needs kids and getting focused on focusing the money to where it belongs. A good example of that, I know I'm stumbling a little bit, but it's really hard for us to break out when a counselor, a school psychologist, a social worker, a school nurse spend 20 minutes or 2 hours or 8 hours with a special needs kid. And so kind of to tag on to what both Lucinda and Scott are saying is there's 1,000 people involved with the education of just a few children. I heard a story this morning in our district where one autism student went with a panel of 10 staff people to be screened and identify specifically what challenges this child was facing, and then develop an appropriate IEP for that kid in order for him to succeed and deal with it early in his life in order to have the best chance for success. And I don't think that that's that uncommon to have 10 people involved in an interaction with that child early on. And you know, we spend so much time counting minutes and hours that we forget that we're educating kids.
Do you want to respond to that?
I'd be irresponsible if I didn't push back a little bit here on my colleague. We don't have the right, under federal law, we don't have the right not to identify a child with a disability. And I will promise you there are parents who expect us to identify if their child has a disability. And I know that's not what you're saying, right, but I don't want you all to have a takeaway from today that we just won't identify these kids, we'll just serve them. I know that's not what Glenn is saying. I want to respond to the question about the census. One of the consortium's recommendations isn't specific to that model, but to actually study other state funding models and determine what applicability there might be to Colorado, rather than just plucking one, because it sounds like a good idea. Really look at them and run some simulations on how it could work in Colorado, would be another recommendation we would make.
And Lucinda, to follow up on that, and thanks for the clarification with Glenn's point, does the funding mechanism we have now lead towards the potential of what Glenn is talking about, that we, in order to meet funding, whether expense requirements or effort requirements, that we essentially have a funding system that is working against the best delivery of special education needs? Or do we have the right system, we're just not funding? How would you think about that?
I can't speak to whether the current funding mechanism works because it's never been fully funded. I think we can all agree that there is a tremendous shortfall between what the revenue is and what the actual expenditures. Remember, I'm not equating expenditures and costs. I do believe that the paperwork and the accounting of how many minutes a nurse spends with a general ed kid, so that percentage of her salary is paid by something, and how much she's spending with a child with a disability, so that percentage comes out of IDEA. funding. I think that's absolutely over the top in terms of time that it takes to do the paperwork.
Okay, so maybe looking for solutions in which it would free, the funding would follow most freely to make sure that the services were provided as best they could be, rather than encumbering the system with having to account for the different funding streams.
I think my point as a retired director of special education would be, what outcomes are we getting for those children? Are they in fact graduating from high school? Do they in fact have employable skills? Are they in fact reading close to grade level? What about those outcomes, as opposed to how well we did filling in you pick the name of the form, how well we did filling in the form?
Dale, you're gonna
Yeah, I think that we need to try to figure out any way that we can remove barriers to doing the right things for kids at the right time. And I think PEG and the Reinventing Special Education, which I'm on there, is a start. Now that's more programmatically, but it might look at funding too. But another step there is, let's look at what's in state law that prohibits us from doing what we need to do for kids. Then let's look at the federal law and see if there's any opportunity for waivers there. And programmatically remove some of those things, and then our dollars will go farther and we'll do a better job. But we do need more money in the system for special ed students.
Any questions? All right, well, let's get oh yeah.
Thank you, and maybe if you take the combination of Glenn and Lucinda's, your ideas about this, I'd just be curious, if you just greenfielded this conversation and said, okay, what if we said we were gonna put all of these dollars into the base, as Glenn suggests you might want to do, and give them to districts with maximum flexibility. And we're going to obviously keep identifying students, and I think Nicole earlier talked about the one federal requirement, of course, would be to demonstrate maintenance of effort. You have to figure out how you demonstrate that maintenance of effort. But I guess what's into my question is, if you did that, let's assume, what else, could we eliminate everything else except for what? To comply with federal law, which is to say all the forms you're describing. If you had a situation where we send all those dollars directly in base, and we said districts will still submit IEPs and monitor them, and will demonstrate maintenance of effort. Could you eliminate every other reporting and monitoring requirement from the state level and just leave that infrastructure? Or what's the most dramatic thing we could possibly do within the law to get to what you're describing as freeing people to do their work?
First of all, I'd like to make it to my car in one piece today, so I'm not sure how much specificity I should say. But there are lots of jokes amongst special ed directors about the indicators, that's what they're called, from the feds, that the state has had to write a plan for how we're going to meet these indicators. And every single time any one of us have a conversation, we'll say, well, does that have an impact on a child's actual performance, their actual achievement towards? So I think one thing that I think would help would be to have some candid conversation with OSEP, which is the Office of Special Education Programs at the federal level, about what are the indicators that really make a difference for student outcomes, real student outcomes, not whether the parent was notified 3 times before the meeting and is one of them. Is the child really achieving to their maximum potential, and how do we measure that? If that could be the focus of people's time, that alone I think would be a big relief for a lot of people. One reason I don't want to presume to give you more specific answers is that I guess I want to just give you a context. If you come at special education from a business model, you're ignoring the embedded tension between free, appropriate, the word appropriate, and when a child with a disability appears on, or a potential disability appears on a district's doorstep, it's their obligation to identify the disability. Do they have one? Yes, no. And if yes, identify what that child's needs are, regardless of cost. And appropriate, a big part of the appropriate conversation is the parent. So you might have a child with Down syndrome, identified in a Down syndrome area, and that parent may say, my dearest wish is for my child to go to their neighborhood school. I want them to attend birthday parties with their peers. I don't care how much it costs you. But in the back of their mind, they're saying, but please don't be mad at me because I know it's going to cost you a lot of money and I know it's going to take money from other people and blah, 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 blah. And then there are other parents who say, it's okay to bus my child across town in that little bus and put them in a classroom with other kids like them. It's called a center-based model. And that, for a businessman, makes sense because it's an economy of scale. So a school district, including those teeny tiny school districts out on the plains, I don't want to ignore the Western Slope, sorry, and the Southeast. The districts have to be prepared for that priority, whatever that priority is for their child. And we, the districts, have to provide it, and under federal law, regardless of cost. Does that make sense to you all? So as you're thinking about, can we just fill in the blank? I'm not trying to make things complicated, but I want you to know there's a very real variable that is a tension between a business model of funding and the reality of identifying what's appropriate for that particular child. I'll give you the most expensive example. A child who is deaf, whose parents says, my child's going to live in a hearing society. I want my child in their neighborhood school. This may not be the most expensive, but you're talking probably a full-time interpreter for that child, plus there are special education supports for that child. And the same district, Littleton had this, could have a parent of a deaf child who says, I want my child to be raised in a deaf community. Find one. Pay for my child to be in that deaf community. And it could be Colorado School for the Deaf and Blind in Colorado Springs. You pay for it, you transport. I'll stop talking.
Scott, you want to take one right?
Yeah, I'll talk money. This is an interesting phenomenon, one I didn't expect. We did our polling, and this has happened twice. We've gone to mill levy elections a number of times. I've never seen one I didn't like. But when I think about potential of state revenue down the road, surprisingly to me, because I'm an advocate for early childhood education, didn't poll nearly as high as I would have anticipated. The highest polling program we had was programs for disabilities. The reason I say that is it gets my thinking going. If we're to have a poll that comes out the same at a statewide, and if we're ever thinking of a statewide election, or when the Lobato suit wins, I'm pausing there. I think we have the potential to do some things around that. I play around in my mind of override elections. We have override elections for general purposes. We have nothing that would go outside that, beyond the level today. Could you go for special education? Could you go for an override that went up, but some portion of that went into a statewide pool? That statewide pool, I mean, if we were going to get more money as a district, as a higher override, our community would say yes. But there are districts such as Walden, because most of their land is Bureau of Land Management or state, they can never pass an election, but shouldn't there be something maybe that goes in the statewide pool that's collected by all of us? You know, we may have only gotten 95%, but 95% would be better than nothing. Just wild-haired idea.
All right, so I'm going to ask you to turn to the folks at your table, and we'll take about 10 minutes. Just some folks, it's easier to kind of process out loud. We've heard a number of possible strategies. Let me just review some of the ones that I've heard. And you may find these great ideas, or you might find significant challenges or problems with these ideas. That's what we want to. So again, we'll kind of stipulate that the conversation is based on a notion that we'll have a question of overall adequacy of funding as part of this discussion, but not today. So assume that these are taking place with that as a given. So some of the solutions have been, we need to focus on the actual cost, not just the expenditures, and what that would lead. So run those numbers and redesign a system that uses the realities. We could look at other state models. We could have a candid conversation with the federal regulators in OSIF about the indicators that make a difference. What's the research suggest is actually leading to student achievement, and kind of back into a funding system based on student achievement. We could move SPED funding to the base. It would free up flexibility for how districts educate students across the board. It might reduce some of the constraints. There's a census model that was proposed. and potential local overrides for special. So those are just a few. You may find these great ideas, you may find these problematic. Discuss them at your table, and we'll ask you to share back out some thoughts with the panel after that. Let's take about 10 minutes. And of course, please introduce yourselves to your fellow table mates if you haven't already. Okay, I think we'll try to pull you back together as a whole group. And I'll try to chart some of the ideas that come out of the group. You may have questions for the panel. You may just be sharing your own solutions. But we'd love to hear some of the table discussion. So, which table would like to start us off? Who kind of generated some new ideas to the discussion that you either want to respond to what the panelists said or throw new ideas onto the table as possible solutions? Any tables willing to kind of share? And then we have a mic in the back and then a mic up here too. Everybody comes to want to influence the policy process, but nobody wants to share ideas? That can't be. Any themes that emerged in your tables?
So this, I think Angelica had a good idea, and it's related to some things that were said, but there are some states that do a better job that fund their full share of special ed, and to sort of look at what they're doing as a way to determine the cost, because that would give us a better idea of what the actual costs are.
It actually makes me realize some of the things that I was shared before we started, possible solutions, researching what the real costs are, especially of high cost pool, potentially fully funding that high cost pool first. There was general agreement about with the panel during the discussion that is something that every district understands how serious that of a risk that is to not adequately fund the high cost pool. And then I think this last point is a good reminder of look at other models, but make sure that there's linkages between increased student achievement with those other funding mechanisms. So thanks for bringing that up. Other ideas or just topics you discussed, maybe questions, things that you wanted to push back on that the panel discussed? Must not be asking provocative questions. Yeah, Angelica's reminding me, this is really, really hard. You're just the moderator. You didn't actually have to think about this. That's a good, go ahead.
At the risk of offending you.
Yeah. No, not at all.
You pointed to this third bullet as an example of what was just said, and that's not what they said. Consider census model, consider other states' models.
Great point. This was from the earlier, more generically, any other state model, that's an example. Thank you very much. Other states. Good clarification. Yes.
One of the things we talked about is how do you build capacity so that you can, is it the state's job, for example, or how do you build capacity so that you have a service delivery component for special ed, so there's some consistency and quality and assurance that the goal is to improve student achievement. And so are there models or things that we should be considering?
Great. Thank you. Good points. How about even just summaries, even if you didn't find a solution, just topics you discussed?
Just two quick things we talked about at our table that I think is valuable to consider that wasn't part of the presentation, but the value of early intervention and what it will cost also in these considerations to look at RTI and the ways that districts are intervening early to prevent that identification and how much it would cost to do that well. And then the other conversation we had some conversation around, does it make sense to incorporate special education in the base, to use a categorical or weight? And I think it's difficult, there's difficulty expressed at our table around coming to conclusions around that until we know what the full cost would look like. And could districts then look and ask the question of themselves, if we were freed up from certain strings and we had adequate resources to do what we needed to do, would that be sufficient? And it's difficult to actually answer that question without really looking at what all this would take.
Right. Really underscores the first point there. Thanks. Things that you wrestled with.
couple questions that came up for us, which Lucinda mentioned the way that the original 1250 number was arrived at. And one thing that we wondered in looking at other state models is this the right number of tiers? That is, do all of the students in Tier A really have the same sets of needs that require the same sets of support? And also with those students in Tier B. We didn't want to, in an attempt to simplify a system, make it overcomplicated and move from 2 tiers to 17 tiers. But we did wonder if there was precedent in other states where you actually are distinguishing between some of the SLD identifications that might actually have different degrees of costs associated with them. So that was one question. And then we also just re-raised the question at our table, regardless of how you do identification, then is this a place where you would want to have some strategy for how you know that dollars follow kids if they are identified with a certain level of need and a certain level of support, and then what structures would be in place to do that. So those 2 comments came up at our table.
I want to address the second part and pass on the first part, but I do think, and this is a little bit of a double-edged sword, but the accounting system we built with the Uniform Chart of Accounts and the account codes does give us a very adequate system for tracking costs. Now, where it becomes really difficult is where we have variable time from all these different people. We generally know OTPTs and SLPs, and those are all 100%, and certainly special ed teachers and aides in the classroom, but it's all those variable ones like the counselors, social workers, school psychologists, where we're really starting to now allocate their time, and it's different every single month or week. That's a real challenge for us in terms of administrative burden.
One of the other things that we talked about was just the regional differences. If you put together a model that might be a Cadillac in one region, but it might be an Impella in another, and maybe even a Geo when you start looking at some of the other places. So that was a concern again. And then we talked a little bit, and we mentioned it earlier, about all the different things that would go into identifying the cost of SPED. And it's just, I mean, the list is almost, once you start listing it, it's almost endless. So.
I just wanted to put a plea in for everybody to contact their respective congressperson to support Congressman Polis's bill to fully fund the federal portion of special education. He introduced the bill, but it has not moved at all because we need the chairman to calendar it. So after the next election, if we could all just have a big push to get Congressman Polis's bill calendared, that would be great, because then we could have that conversation at the federal level.
What's the price tag on that, Sue?
It was about $17 million, as I recall. I'd have to look it up.
17
billion.
What's a few zeros amongst friends?
You know, that's the first time we've really talked about sequestration, and we are really afraid to death of that. Depending on what that looks like as that rolls down, and if there's any relief of maintenance of effort related to that, that could be absolutely devastating.
Could you give us a little bit some of the details if you've run some preliminary numbers or worst case scenarios, or what might that mean?
I haven't, but I've heard the numbers thrown around between 5 to 10% of federal funding that we would lose across the board, including Title I and 6B, 6B being the special ed funding. And just in our district alone, that's a couple of $1 million just for the SPED portion that we would lose. And if we're having to pick that up out of local share, as we've already been basically broken for the last 6-7 years, it's just absolutely devastating to us.
One of the other ironic things about sequestration is that a district that has more federal funds, you know, Title I and special ed and all those, because they have those needy children, they would get hit the worst. Mm-hmm. It'd be a higher percentage. So it's almost the opposite of what should be being done. But that, so I've heard 7 to 9 to as high as 14%, depending upon certain districts with high needs kids, and so it's really significant.
It's an interesting question for this group to wrestle with as we think about this designing a 21st century funding stream. one argument would be fully funding it from the federals. It also makes you more precariously placed in situations like this. So it's hard to know exactly how you balance out one's dependence on the federal funds versus where that leaves you. Yes.
So I haven't heard us address at all one other group of high need students, and I'm a little surprised given some of the other people in the room, but many states or some states include gifted education in their special ed funding. And I think that that's a group of kids, of very high needs kids that we haven't even discussed at all. And for all intents and purposes, we really don't fund it all. And I think that if I'm not mistaken, the Lobato lawsuit, one of the original named plaintiffs, that arose from a district's failure to be able to meet those particular needs. So I think we should definitely consider that.
It's a great point. Panelists want to weigh in on that at all? Or just acknowledging it's a good point? How to do that? Yes.
Thanks. So I'm fortunate I've got a couple of CFOs at my table, and so I asked them the question, when we look at the total amount of dollars that are being spent, I basically just asked the question, what is that money being spent on? And I'm a former teacher myself, and you know, I would have a class with 10 special ed students, you know, first period, and then a class of 3 special ed students, and then a class of 5 and 6, and the amount of resources I got as a teacher didn't change from class to class. So basically my question was, well, how is that money being spent? The response from them was that it's mostly salary and benefits for adults, for teachers or, you know, administrators or whoever is focused on the compliance. And so my thought was, well, is it possible, at least possible, to drive that number down somehow, whether it's through better training, early intervention was mentioned, technology, different things that are available. I think maybe getting away from the idea is, well, we have more special ed students, therefore we have to hire more people. Trying to maybe get away from that paradigm that maybe we've fallen into in the past is at least maybe one way to address the one half of this conversation, which is the expenditures, you know, and then we can address the revenue side.
A number of these solutions, just to echo, I think a point the panel made is that one suggestion like that can cause concern in advocates who worked hard to get those staffing, but if we keep the constant without adversely affecting student achievement, using that as the arbiter of what's a good move or a bad move, is this advancing the cause of student achievement, then you can have the conversations about what's the most efficient use of resources. I think it's a point that's been well made.
And I don't want to debate it because I think it's a valid point, but sometimes I think our communities don't appreciate or understand how time-intensive instruction of special needs students are. That in this world where we try to do everything faster and better, when you have an autistic child that is screaming in a classroom, you know, it's all about slowing down and de-escalating and all the other pieces of that puzzle. And I just don't think people get how time intensive that is. That this is not a productivity example, and I'm really referring to the world outside us that just doesn't get that. And so I just want to put in a passionate plug for those special needs staff and students that, God bless them, that job is hard. I mean, to sit with a child that is representing some of those behaviors day in and day out can be so emotionally draining. And to do that and have a heart for kids, it's something the public never understands, and it's hard to put a price tag on that piece.
Yes, Bruce.
Just to elaborate a little bit on what Glenn is saying, when I worked in a school district, we had a program called MOVE. The entire program was built on helping a child begin to move their body in ways that can support themselves, whether sitting or almost standing. And I think sometimes we forget a little bit about the severity of the needs that our schools serve and what that really takes to serve those kids as well as the kids who are more minimally affected. So just something to think about in terms of resources. And our table, when we talked about resources, we had a little bit of a disagreement, I think, but we didn't disagree on the fact that we are inadequately funding special education in a general sense. Can I say that?
quick follow-up. I think a point that I didn't make was what I was saying as a teacher. A lot of times when I had a class with special ed students, I didn't necessarily feel like I needed another adult in the classroom as much as I felt like I needed more training myself, and that's something that I would take with me year to year. And I think sometimes when we think of, and I'm talking mainly about Tier A, not Tier B, right now we think, well, we have more special ed students, we need to hire more people. I think if we change that paradigm and more, how do we better train and qualify the people we have, not only is it more cost effective, but I think the outcomes are better.
Thanks for clarification. Got just a few more minutes. Any closing comments or final thoughts to add into the public record? David. Oh, great.
I think that, as we're looking at the context of our conversation today, I'm jump on the rail car with Scott. The challenge is we're having a conversation about SPED as if it is something that is a separate rail car. And that's a difficult concept in some regards, because whether SPED is thought to be adequately funded or not is, to me, sort of a false leader. The point is we expend, if and I say if just because let's just say it this way, trusting that the numbers from CDE are right, we've got this factor of a 1.4 cost differential. That suggests then that 9 out of 10 students are subsidizing the education of a special education student. And I think at the end of the day, we're trying to educate 10 out of 10 students. And so the question then becomes, as we have a responsibility to demonstrate an effective use of resources across K-12, SPED, non-SPED, charter, non-charter, what have you. At the end of the day, there's a question of, do you have adequate resources to deliver the outputs that you're expected to deliver? So when we, again, as I'll emphasize a point from last time, when we have the discussion of costs versus expenditures, it's irrelevant unless we start to tie those costs to the expectation of what we're supposed to produce on an annual basis and at the point of graduation. And so I don't know that we're still in the place of having a conversation about what we can afford relative to what it is we're expected to produce. It feels to me, that we have this two-sided coin. And one side of the coin is you learn to do more with less, you learn to live within your means. We all manage our budgets. We allocate the funds across the entirety of K-12 to the highest and best use that we possibly know how. But the other side of the coin says you get what you pay for. And when Colorado has funding at the level it does, we'll do what we need to do to subsidize to the compliance requirements we have uniformly. But we at some day are going to have to pay the piper to say, when you are funding day after day after day, decade after decade, below state averages, you're going to have to recognize that we work in a national labor pool. And at some point, the folks that we're expecting to live here, to work here, and to invest in our communities are not going to be just attracted by the beautiful mountains, and they're going to think about the nature of the investments we're making into K-12 in its entirety. And that's something that we have to come to grips with, whether that's from a revenue side or an expenditure side or some combination. It feels to me that when we treat, whether it's SPED or whether it's ELL or it's at risk, whether we think of at risk based on poverty or at risk based upon where they might, an individual student might matriculate to, whether they're gifted and talented or whether they're severe needs, we have to have, and that's why this is a very hard problem. It's really having to have the conversation. And I know you started out to say that this is meant to be a conversation, comprehensive, but it really is hard to differentiate SPED as a separate piece when we know we're having to subsidize that to such great margin.
Thanks. It being hard and my willingness to let you off the hook for the final task are not related things. So I'm hoping you'll still turn over that sheet on the back of your pamphlet that you were given today. Is just a space, and we tried to create a couple of different ways. This is on the opening handout with the agenda. We tried to create a couple of ways for you to offer your feedback, and it may just be question marks. We know that this is a difficult set of conversations, but would love the kind of synthesis of your ideas as best you can articulate them for how we should consider this issue. I've tried to track some of the ideas you've given up here, but would love to capture anything that we didn't hear shared out in the whole group that you talked about at your tables. And Will and Hannah, Will, if you don't mind raising your hand one more time, so please give these to Will on your way out, so we can have those before you leave. And are those? Oh yes, we're passing around. What color dots do we have today? Yellow. Today's a yellow dot day, so you don't want to miss your yellow dot on your name tag. And then lastly, we have the comment cards too. The last piece we've done at each meeting is to get your feedback on today's session, ways to improve it, closing thoughts, suggestions for next steps in this process, anything about the process itself. So we'll give you a couple minutes to complete those closing feedback sheets at your tables.
Dale,
Good
job. Thanks.
And then round of applause for our panelists as well for sparking the conversation. Lots of important points, and just your interaction as well of kind of guarding in such a civil way the multiple interests of this conversation. So that was very well done and well chosen for whoever selected our panel. And I guess lastly, I will turn back to Senator Johnston, although he may be mid-conversation. I don't know if there's any other closing thoughts from your vantage point. Sorry to interrupt your...
I just want to say another thank you to everybody for coming out. I will offer one closing thought about costs, which is, it's interesting, if you look at the infrastructure by which special ed is funded. I'm going to wait for 1 second just to get everybody's attention. The teacher and me will still wait for just a minute. Thank you. If you look at the way in which special ed is funded, what you have is a rare occurrence where you have a profound and aggressive piece of federal legislation defended by incredibly powerful and clear Supreme Court rulings, which have said, no matter what the cost is to you, local district, to educate this kid, no amount is too much. So figure it out. And this is why you have, by my math, about a $575 million unfunded mandate in the state of Colorado alone. What I find interesting about that is the other deeply affected populations we have, like kids that are English language learners, or kids that are at risk and significantly behind grade level, have no similar federal or constitutional mandate. Which means there is nothing that says if we don't adequately fund an at-risk kid, that no matter what it costs, you have to find a way, superintendent, to give that kid everything she needs to get services, means that we are dramatically underestimating what the unfunded liability is on all of those other populations that have significant needs that don't also have constitutional mandates behind them. And so it was at first shocking to me to, we talked about our table, the fact that if you had passed Proposition 103, that would have barely filled the unfunded special ed liability by itself. $575 million a year was almost only special ed, and you would have been done before you touched anything else in the finance formula with a negative factor. And so you think about that, and then you think about the other populations of kids for whom we know you all are bending over backwards to try to find a way to serve them. But unlike special education disabilities, the other characteristics are not distributed evenly across the population. I always believe the reason why there is a different mandate behind this is because there are probably, fitting with the census data, 12% of US senators who have kids in their families with disabilities. There are not 12% of US senators who have kids in their family who are below the poverty line, or who are English language learners. And so what you don't have is a coalition of political will to say, we don't care how much it costs, just get it done. On the other factors, the way that we do here. But you all, because you have the conviction to do that, are doing it anyway. So you're saying we have to find a way to get it done for all kids, even if there's not a Supreme Court telling us to do it, or a federal law telling us to do it. So today was a little bit overwhelming to me in realizing the scope of how far we've underfunded what we have to do, but also realizing how do we keep that conviction to serve every kid well, and then find a way to extend that not only to kids with special needs, but to kids with the other characteristics that we know are going to make it hard for them to get, as you all were saying, to the outcomes we care about. Graduated, ready with the skills they need to have a college or a career, or a healthy family and pay the bills. And so a lot of work to do, but I think that's why we're all here together. So thank you so much to the panelists and to the presenters. Really, really helpful day and a lot of food for thought going into next time. So thank you again so much.
And will our next meeting time and location? October 30th from 2 to 5. We'll be at the Capitol next time, not here. Unfortunately, we'll be at the Capitol October 30th, 2 to 5. We hope to see you there, and make sure, please, we'd love to grab your forms before you go.